Hi, good afternoon or good morning if you're in the East, or excuse me, if you're in the West. Good morning, good afternoon if you're in the East. I assume everyone is switching over, having just watched the Artemis astronauts break the Apollo record, and now we are going to break the record for the most interesting deep dive on educational assessment and data. So buckle up. I'm Andy Rotherham. I'm a senior partner and a co-founder here at Bellwether. I'm joined by a terrific panel who they're going to introduce themselves in just a moment. And thanks to all of you for joining. If you're new here, Bellwether, we're a national nonprofit. We work with a range of organizations, school districts, state education departments, charter school networks, policy advocates, nonprofits, vendors, and others to help them solve challenges and create better educational experiences for young people. We publish reports and resources. We do a lot of proprietary work, and we host conversations like this one to help leaders, policymakers, and everyone else who cares about education make sense of what is happening. You can learn more about our work at bellwether.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and so forth to be involved. This Bellwether LinkedIn Live is sponsored by Curriculum Associates. Curriculum Associates is dedicated to making K-12 classrooms better for 17 million students and 1 million educators across the country by uniting meaningful data insights with high-quality instruction. They partner with educators to deliver a connected portfolio of iReady solutions spanning adaptive assessment, personalized instruction, and core curriculum in ELA and math. Curriculum Associates measures success by the impact it makes on student outcomes. And they're honored to support the extraordinary work of educators around the country, helping every student thrive. I'd urge you to go to their website at Curriculum Associates and check them out and learn more. At Bellwether, we're very grateful to our sponsors. They make events like this possible. They do, however, have no editorial control over the content. And Bellwether doesn't take editorial positions on anything. So the views you're going to hear today for our panelists are the views of those panelists alone. Couple of housekeeping things. One of the advantages of watching this live, if you're joining later, you can watch it. It'll be replayed. Most of these get replayed and get multiples of views afterwards. But if you're watching live, the advantage is you get to ask questions. And so you should use the question box to ask questions. I'll be monitoring those. We will, and we'll jump in with those. And the chats are usually a place. Also, you'll see people sharing resources and so forth. And that's great. So that means if you need to leave early, you want to watch any of the conversation again, as soon as we're done today, this will be available for replay on the platform at the exact same link. And as I said, we host lots of these conversations. So if you want to find out about them, sign up for our stuff. What I'm going to ask each of our participants to do is to introduce themselves. We have a really great lineup. But what's really interesting about them is they each come from a different sort of assessment tool and assessment strategy. And so I certainly don't want to pit them against each other. This isn't like going to be the Hunger Games of testing, but I am going to ask them to talk about what makes the assessments they offer. What is the unique value add, the differentiator that makes it different and uniquely valuable? As they introduce themselves, then we'll get into this more. Lesley, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks. Hi, good morning, afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Lesley Muldoon. I'm the executive director at the National Assessment Governing Board, and we set policy for NAEP, or the Nation's Report Card. And folks who know NAEP know that its biggest strength is its ability to provide data, in particular in fourth grade reading and mathematics and eighth grade reading and mathematics, that you can compare with confidence across all 50 states, across about 24 large urban districts, and importantly, across time, right? Going back about 35 years for all 50 states, we have these NAEP trend lines that everybody finds so valuable and useful.
Kristen?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Huff. I'm with Curriculum Associates, and the program I'm here to talk about today is our iReady assessment, which is administered 3 times a year in mostly in grades K through 8, and it was designed primarily, and its primary purpose and use is to inform instruction, and so that's our claim to fame.
Okay, so we got Kristen is at the teacher level. We got Lesley at the national level. Zach, I think that leaves one place.
Well, maybe more than one, but at least my place in this is, my name is Zach Warner. I'm the Assistant Commissioner over Assessment with the New York State Education Department. As a state, we have very traditional assessments that are required under federal laws, but New York actually has, at least the oldest I've ever come across, a state level program in that our high school exams have their origin in 1865. They've changed a lot since then, but Kristen said some pretty key words with purpose and use that I think you're going to hear from this group an awful lot. But one of the things we really focus on at the state level is knowing that there is so much that goes on with the programs Lesley described and the program Kristen described at the federal and then the much more localized level. Where can we in the middle come in and say, what does comparison look like across New York State and around our districts? And how can we use those results to see, are there opportunities to add resources, add support, target support, and just really try to help on the ground?
All right, let's go a little deeper on each of these. Lesley, I want to come back to you. So, like, what data do you think the NAEP is particularly good at providing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that NAEP is particularly good at providing a sort of broad indicator of academic achievement in core subjects. And in reading and mathematics, we are able to do that for, as I said, all the 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, the Bureau of Indian Education, Department of War Education Agency, and the large urban districts that volunteer. So it's this sort of consistent measure that represents the union, if you will, of like what we as a country think is really important to for kids to know and be able to do in reading and mathematics. We also have assessments in civics and U.S. history and science and writing, although we haven't administered that one in a while. So we are able to provide a broader array of assessment results than most states can. But those other subjects we typically only report out at the national level. So, you know, a broad indicator of how U.S. students are doing in those subjects.
And you can do it longitudinally, so you can not back to 1865,
No.
but you can go back decades, so people can see, as the name implies, progress.
Sure.
Okay, and you do that. I think it's important, and I'll ask Mackenzie to throw in the chat in the comments. We had Laura Lagerfo from IES over to talk about this a while ago and to go deep on the sampling. So we don't need to do that here. But you give this to a sample of students. You talked about all the different places. So the Department of Defense schools, the Bureau of the BIE schools, all these different, you do rural, but you're giving it to a sample of students. Could you just briefly double click on that? Because that is different than these other assessments.
Yeah. So one of NAEP's goals is to provide representative results that are representative of the state as a whole or of the nation as a whole without assessing all tens of millions of kids across the country every year. So we use very sophisticated statistical methods and sampling methods to make sure we're drawing a sample of kids in each state that represents that population in the given year that we're assessing. So and then from that, kids take a portion of the assessment. No child takes the entire NAEP assessment. They'll take about an hour's worth of content in either reading or math or whatever subject we're fielding. And then through lots of important psychometrics that we don't want to go into, folks at NCS and their contractors can put together a score, right, that represents the state's achievement based on that representative population of kids.
And so with you, we get a little bit of efficiency. You do. I mean, it's an elaborate psychometric process, but you can sample kids and still and sometimes a critique of the test is you're like, well, hardly any kids take that, but that's actually a strength of it in the sense that it's comprehensive. It's complicated to administer, and the actual going to the field is elaborate. But you can test a sample of kids and still yield really valuable data for policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my own fourth grader took NAEP this year, which was really exciting. He was randomly chosen. I had nothing to do with it, and I asked him how it was, and he said, "Oh, it was easy. Like no big deal, right?" So it was just an hour of his day. Now I know his principal and the staff at school spent some time, getting the kids ready, getting the computer lab ready, all those things. But for the actual children, it's a pretty, small, short experience, and hopefully not a lot of burden on them. That's our goal.
Great, and it's given, as you said, on these various cycles, but it's not given. Every student doesn't take every test annually. Zach, you were talking about, though, in New York, you guys run an annual assessment program that's required under federal law. And as you were saying, New York was doing that prior to when that became a federal requirement. So talk about, like, what information does your test give that's unique? Same question as Lesley. What are some of the unique differentiators that you guys can offer?
Sure. And actually, there's a lot in common with what Lesley was talking about, because our exams are standards-based tests. So we are benchmarking against learning standards, what we in New York have determined that we think students should know, be able to demonstrate, where they should go with that. And so our tests are going to be much more specific to both growth and status of how students are doing in those particular things. And I call those both out because it's pretty important to be able to say, hey, this year, this is the level of proficiency around the state. This is the proficiency of school at school A, school B, but also to be able to look at that over time in a similar way as Lesley was talking about. Say, look at this. This school has traditionally struggled, but with added resources, with supports, we are starting to see growth there, and we're seeing that go. I think another important part is, again, my state level tests are somewhat limited. They are standards-based, but they're limited to math, English, science. We do have state level social studies testing at the high school level, which we're pretty proud of and have had for a long, long time. But that's kind of it. So one thing you'll never hear me talk about is that we've got everything covered, or that we know everything at the state level about a kid. And so that's one of those things where we're close partners with not just our colleagues in an accountability office, but in our special education office, our bilingual education office. And we're actually right now in New York doing a lot of cool things where we're trying to build assessment capacity at the local level, really trying to say, hey, I answer that question, Andy, that you just posed all the time. Like, this is what I can do at the state level. We all agree that's not everything you'd want to know. So what are you doing at the local level? How can we make those systems talk to each other and start to really make sense? Because one of the last things I'll cover for here is I often am engaged. I have a fourth grader also, in fact, did not take NAEP, Lesley. I don't know. We'll have to work on that next time. But
apparently, Lesley knows how to make that happen for you.
Yeah. Apparently, next time
that's the answer.
We'll
you have to live in the district with tutor level results.
Yeah, she knows the guy.
Yeah, and but so one of the things, I talk to parents a lot. I talk to that, and I will hear comments about, my student, I just don't know that state level test reflected how I think they were doing. And I always follow that up with more questions. Well, okay, how are they doing in their classroom? Do they take other assessments out there like an iReady, or, what do they do there? And one of the things we always talk about is that data triangulation, because I have probably had 50-50 conversations where I hear, well, no, their teacher said they were really doing great. And yeah, no, they've knocked it out of the park on their benchmark or other assessments. At that point, can we believe that on a one test that maybe you didn't show your best? Yeah, absolutely. Again, I've got a fourth grader. I know what it looks like any given day. At the same time, sometimes we start to hear things like, well, the teacher said it's been a rough year and they struggled with some concepts and that. Yeah, no, I got some reports from our benchmark tests at home, and it really said they had a lot to work on. And then I start to go, okay, well, when we start to see this more holistic picture. So really, I think, my tests are good at being part of the picture that can help us, direct more resources, look back, but, really on that high level, aspect looking down.
And how quickly, if I'm a teacher in New York, how quickly do I get the results back from your assessment?
So we've been working on a couple of things. So New York, parts I don't want to talk about. New York has been a late adopter in some places, and one of those was technology. New York is a huge state, 2.7 million students. Certainly, we've got span the gamut in terms of resource needs, in geography. I actually did my student teaching up on the Canadian border and have a lot of familiarity with the North Country. And then, of course, we have by far the largest school district in the nation. And so there's a lot of variability out there, and technology was slow in coming. And I bring that up because computer-based testing is by far the way to speed up results. there. So we are finally making some headway in terms of getting full-on results, where here is your scaled score, here is your performance level, here is that. And so you are still looking at, probably 2 months between that time. But I do want to highlight what we've done to kind of bridge that gap. New York does have a very strong data infrastructure. We have 13 regional data centers that work directly with districts on them. And we've been able to flow back individual item scores to them in under a month. So at this time, you are seeing, wow, 82% of the kids in my class got number 47 right, which measures this standard. And I can compare that to the rest of the other schools in my area, only 42% of that. So we've really tried to make comparable data available to them. But I think when you get to Kristen, she's going to say something that I very much agree with about maybe we don't want you reading too deeply into those state level results when it gets to the student perspective.
So, okay, Kristen, that's going to be that's a good segue, because I mean, the question I want to ask you, so you're operating at the place where teachers are getting real-time results that they can then use in terms of as they're thinking about instruction and what kids need. So talk about that, and then other things that are sort of unique differentiators for what you offer at that classroom level.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. So for the iReady assessment, we're able to offer some unique reports or unique assets based on how we designed it. So as always, form follows function. So the assessment was designed under the umbrella called computer adaptive testing, which means that unlike I think either NAEP or the state tests, we are able to adapt through the computerized technology, through adaptive testing algorithms, adapt the questions so that we're able to report out on for a student, for any given student, Andy, say that you are chronologically sitting in a third grade classroom, but for some domains, you are not performing at a third grade level. So we're able to make statements like, for numbers and operations, Andy is performing on grade level, but for geometry and measurement, Andy is performing at more of a first grade level. And we're able to do this not just because of the adaptive nature of the assessment, but because we designed from the beginning to measure against these rigorous grade level standards in reading and math. So those statements that we're able to provide about whether you're on grade level or below grade level, that's not a norm referenced grade level equivalent. That's not what that is. That is based on how you tested, how you answered questions right or wrong, where your knowledge and skill set mostly lines up is for this domain, it's at third grade, but for this other domain, it's at first grade. And because those domain level placements are in relation to those rigorous grade level standards, and because undergirding that, we have a perspective on how students move through that learning trajectory for any given standard within a domain, we're able to say, okay, for Andy, who is, 2 grade levels behind in this domain, here are our recommended next steps so that we can close those gaps and get Andy to a place where he can access the grade level material that is typically taught, on grade level to the whole class. And so those additional materials, this gets confusing sometimes when we talk because we do have a lot of instruction, but those like closing the gap materials, they actually come as part of the reports from the assessment. So those are some unique differentiators. And it really, again, I want to underscore that we're able to produce these these kinds of resources based on the student's assessment results because the assessment was designed that way. So this is not us, trying to retrofit an instructional model that undergirds the assessment, a norm referenced assessment. This is actually designed from the beginning to produce these kinds of materials.
I think what we're getting here is in most places you have this overlay of national data that gets, depending on often on what it shows, policymakers are more or less excited to highlight it, the NAEP, but is out there. And so analysts can use it across the country. You got a state assessment program and they got a local assessment programs going on that are generally third-party vendor provided, you all and other companies in the space. We heard one mistake that people make when they think about all this, which is to take any single result on any one of these things. And in the case of the NAEP, you can't even tie it to a specific student. But to take one of like a single data point and extrapolate wildly from it. But what are some other mistakes as people, this is a question to all three of you, as people sort of consume this, what are other mistakes that you see in terms of how this what is really a rich tapestry of data ends up getting misused?
Well, I can pick up where I left off and give a more concrete example. I think
if it doesn't have to involve me, that would be great, but give any example.
I'll switch to Zach next time. But I think that due to its unfortunate name of a grade level equivalent, that consumers of their students' score reports typically get very confused by this. So I didn't prepare this hypothetical in advance, so I'll do it off the top of my head. But let's say that I'll use myself. I'm chronologically in fourth grade, and my grade level equivalent score, says that I'm at the I forget I'm at a grade level equivalent of, fifth grade, but maybe it's, 5, I think they do it in years and months, like 5.2. So, for reading, you're actually, my daughter, she's chronologically in fourth grade, but in reading, she's a grade level equivalent of 5.2. And 5.2 means that she's equivalent to a fifth grader in its second month. And as a parent, I'm celebrating. But as we know from state tests and from NAEP, that for your typical fourth grade population, fifth grade population, most students are not performing proficiently on grade level standards. So that 5.2 doesn't tell you anything about how your fourth grader is doing against fourth grade standards, and therefore can be misleading because it's based on average, how are students performing in fourth grade versus fifth grade based on that score. And it has nothing to do with the actual knowledge and skills required for proficiency. So I think that can be very, very confusing for most people, not just parents or public, the general public who are not thinking about these kinds of statistics, all day long.
Okay, great. I want to come back on this issue of what proficiency means. So let's put that, and we'll come back to that later.
Can I pick up on the proficiency point? Because one of the things that we see a lot is, and Kristen, I learned something because my children get iReady score reports, and I didn't know that. So thank you. On terms of proficiency, though, one of the things we see with NAEP proficient versus proficient on a state test, like people try to compare. They try to say, well, in New York State or in New Jersey, X percent of students are scoring proficient on the reading test, but NAEP is saying it's this many points lower, right? Well, you can't actually compare the percent proficient on two different assessments when they set proficiency standards to a different definition. And I know this is one of people's biggest frustrations with NAEP, right? Particularly in state education agencies, right? That the way that NAEP proficient gets interpreted versus the way state proficient is interpreted or defined creates a lot of confusion. And we try to do our best to share examples of like, well, what does it mean to actually be NAEP proficient, right? It means that you can, our policy definition is mastery over challenging subject matter content, right? But what does that mean for a parent? What does that mean for a policymaker to try to make sense of? We have work to do there, I think.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because I do want to talk about these proficiency levels and what it means. But Zach, what are some common misuses you see? I mean, you guys put out a lot of data every year. What are some common mistakes that people make as they're thinking about this, either that data itself or in comparison to other assessments and other data points that are out there?
Yeah, I think it's exactly, what we've been talking about is what the results mean. The amount of times I've picked up a newspaper and read that, blank % of third graders failed the state test. And I don't even know what the state test classifies you into different categories of, developing, partial proficiency, advanced. I didn't hear pass or fail to be any of those, but people will tell us that children are somehow failing a state test that's not there. So, really, what does that result mean? And we work hard, and I'm talking with the right group of two others here, because I know both Kristen's program and Lesley's program have tremendous undergirding in what those scores mean in terms of knowledge and skills. And we don't go there. There's such an opportunity to say, this is the score I got in this level of performance. And I can draw direct lines to, these are the types of things that I know and are able to do. And here are places I can go from here. So it's that immediate growth is built into that. And that's the thing that constantly gets us is we're coming in to just do a quick temperature check. If you showed up at the doctor and they came in, felt your forehead and said, you have the flu, let me give you a prescription, you'd probably rightfully be switching doctors. But at the same time, you'd want that too. If they came in and never took your temperature, that would seem weird also. So when we're trying to create a system that talks about, the right tools for the right job, our state comes in there and tries to do that. Would I say, and this is happening around the country, you've seen some people, especially with reading, have said, if you do not perform at a certain level, you cannot advance in a grade level. I would never say that. That is not how we see things here in New York, because again, what is the purpose of this test? We are trying to see on a given day in April or May, generally, what can you show us about your English language arts, your math, and your science proficiently? And then importantly, we want to aggregate that so that we can look across your school, across your district, and ultimately across the state to say, hey, this was really about looking at, how is your school? Does your school have enough resources? Are you getting what you need as a community? What else are these other variables? And then say, oh, and by the way, you can't go to 5th grade. Seems a bit disconnected. And so all that to say, take it seriously, but don't read so far in that you're actually making the wrong interpretations.
Yeah, Zach, when you say that, sorry,
Please.
Yeah, so Zach, when you say that, it reminds me of, something that, I learned from, some of the greats in the field of assessment, including Bob Mislevy, who reminds us that we are always, when it comes to assessments and scores, we're always reasoning from imperfect evidence. And that means that we need, especially as test makers, we need to be humble about that and retain that humility, because a student's test score, a student's homework assignment, a student's presentation at school, none of those things are what a student has learned or knows and can do. Those are only proxies, and they all are imperfect measures, and we need to be humble in that. So I just wanted to jump in and give that acknowledgement to the giants before us.
Yeah, no, that's a great that's a absolutely great point. And I want to ask for questions. I was going to prompt everybody, just if you have questions, put them in the chat so we can get to these. Those can be questions to all the panelists or questions to a particular panelist. Get those in the chat. I mean, so I'm intrigued by this idea Well, first let's go to the proficiency thing and we can come back. We talk about it a lot. Lesley said they have examples on the website. It is a proxy, as you said, Kristen, but a good standard is a proxy that like we put some value in and some weight in that. Okay, if you can do this task, it's indicative of your ability to do these other things. But I'm not even sure, and for the most part, people really know what we're talking about when we talk about proficient. So people say like, well, NAEP proficient and a state proficient is different, but do they even know like either one, for instance, what it actually, so can you have a conversation about, well, maybe NAEP's too high, maybe the state's too low, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. So like talk about like just this idea that the people who are designing these things at a policy level, but especially parents, do they even understand when we're talking about proficiency, like what we're talking about in any way that's like crosswalked to real life?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that parents, the average parent hears the word and probably thinks it means the child has, can do the work at the grade level that in the way that's expected of them. And that's probably about it. So, and I certainly don't think any parent who doesn't work in assessment would really understand the difference between NAEP proficient and a state proficiency standard. I mean, Andy, as you know, we produce a report that tries to map state proficiency cut scores onto the NAEP scale. It's pretty wonky, but it is actually, I think, our most widely read, most widely used tool beyond the NAEP Nations Report Card itself, because it does attempt to show like the relative rigor of states' individual proficiency cut scores.
And the directional level, I'll say, as a state, when I was on the state board in Virginia, it's very useful because it, like, you may not want to get into parsing fine distinctions, but if you're if you have like the biggest gap between like NAEP proficient and state proficient, you should at least be asking some questions about, okay, why is that? Where are neighboring states? I think that's a very valuable report because it's a conversation starter in a directional way.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we've been trying to do in recent rounds of reporting on the Nation's Report Card is not only talk about the percent of students who are reaching proficiency, but also talk about the percent who are or are not reaching the NAEP basic level, because that is sadly a growing share of students across grades and subjects. And I mean, when you put it into the context of actual skills and knowledge that students are likely to have at that or not have, if you have students who haven't reached NAEP Basic in fourth grade, it means they're not likely to be able to locate whole numbers on a number line or determine the relevant meaning of a familiar word using context from a text that they've read. So those are, I mean, foundational skills that you would want any fourth grader to have, and whether it's basic or proficient, like we want to try to ground the conversations in those skills. But I think the terminology of basic, proficient, Zach, the terminology that you use in New York is a good shorthand, right? It's intended to be a shorthand, but you sort of lose the meaning behind it when you do that.
Yeah, I think Lesley said a lot of important things there, and I think one, to give a certain amount of, parents are busy. There's a lot going on that, you give your child to the school with the hope that they are, moving them towards what they need to be, what that is. So while I very much agree that a parent doesn't know what proficiency means, I also think if we said, well, hold on now, what is it that your child should be able to do by the end of this year or something like that? That's a difficult conversation too. And that's so what we need to do as not just the assessment community, but kind of the education community, is there needs to be that discourse, and that there was an article, I want to say it was Wendy Yen did back in 2007 or so, basically, which just said basically, what do parents want to know? And they found a lot of times what they wanted to know is my child on track to where they need to be to ultimately graduate? Is my child keeping up with their peers? Those are the types of questions parents wanted to know. So even though I'd love to sit here and tell you the wonderful materials that my office puts out that back maps to the learning standards, I'm not sure I could say in good conscience, mom and dad need to print out the 40 pages of learning standards and start flipping through and saying, what does this look like? So I think it becomes a communication challenge on how do we talk about these things, and in a way that we can assure parents that we are measuring something that matters, your children are learning something that matters and moving there, but knowing full well that, I'm not sure that's even a reasonable expectation of a parent, right? To be able to say, I have a full understanding of what fourth grade proficiency looks like. And so that's part of the challenge here. And we have a responsibility as the assessors to be able to not only give you the result, but give you the so what of that result in terms of this is what it means. And research has shown that your child is on track to be successful. We've actually tagged that on to the end of our performance levels, where we say students performing at this level are, and we couch it, I'll be honest, but we say, are likely to be able to succeed in the next level of coursework without significant support or things like that. Because, that's what they want to know is, are you ready to move on to the next grade? Are you ready to move on to college, to career, to trade, to military, to whatever comes next? And, that's the kind of communication challenge that falls on us.
So, Kristen, how does this land with you? Because I feel like underneath all this, the most common thing that teachers are going to be talking to parents about is often how students are faring on these various, whether it's yours or one of your peers in the industry, these various tools. So here's the progress they're making, or here's something we need to work on. So there's all this stuff happening at the national level, the policy level, with what Lesley's doing, the state level with what Zach's doing. But the day to day, it's more likely to be, oh yeah, we use iReady, and here's what it's telling me right now about where your child is, and here's what we need to work on, or here's what is great.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we don't make a claim about is we don't make any claims about proficiency. We're lucky with that. I mean, we are very deliberate in those. We do classify students, and given how our system works, we use the labels early, meaning early on grade level, mid on grade level, and late. And that is a nod to it might be September and you're taking the assessment and but you're already performing as if it were mid-year. That would be a very impressive performance. But we so we avoid this notion of proficiency. But we are people are whether it's our users in school buildings or parents typically assume that mid is proficient, because we do have a lot of empirical data with various state tests that show if you're in the green, meaning you're mid or late for on grade level, you are likely to hit whichever states we're talking about, their benchmark for proficiency. And that's an empirical relationship. But what we have found, and both Lesley and Zach mentioned this, is that yes, parents are interested in, is my student learning, which is why growth metrics are so important, and are they on track to continue to be successful and move on and be successful in the next grade level. And another thing we found is that let's get out of the labels as soon as we can and actually look at just either descriptions of what students can do that we're confident that they can do, or descriptions of the skills that they need to work on in order to move along that learning trajectory. We are working in our R&D and in our evolution of our reports to rely more on sample items. I think those are so powerful. A parent may not know, I don't have an example off the top of my head when it comes to a learning standard, but can identify 2D and 3D shapes, or whatever. But you show them an item and you say, you know, items like this, this is what we want to see students be able to do by the end of third grade, and your child is still struggling with these kinds of items that we expect students to be able to master at the end of first grade. That's when you can really start to shed some light on what we mean with all of this, you know, skills, proficiency, learning standards.
But do we make this harder than it has to be? So if Scott Marion were here, he might say something like, it's hard to argue that algebra is very different in New Hampshire than Wyoming. And I'm not putting words in his mouth because he is here and he put that in the chat. And it's a legitimate point. Are we making this more complicated? And I know, Lesley, the current policies, obviously, of the current administration is not towards any kind of national standard, where in the past, previous administrations, there has been a policy to start to move towards that. It has not been extremely popular for different reasons among different constituencies. But algebra is the same in Wyoming and New Hampshire. That's not wrong. And would it be easier if we got more towards some sort of common measure? Zach, as a state person, how do you think about that? And Kristen, as a vendor, like, does that end up creating inefficiencies? Just that it would be better for kids if they didn't exist. So Zach, you first.
Sure. And I think one thing we'd have to, you know, I'm channeling a former president, I guess, here, but, you know, we have to define this, don't we? You know, this would be easier. You know, would it be easier to get a sense of kids' algebra across the entire country if we decided, you know what, for the purposes of this argument, here's what algebra is, let's sample the states? Oh yeah, it'd be way easier that. And could we do that at somewhat of a macro level where do I agree? You know, I used to teach algebra. Yeah, I taught it in Massachusetts, I taught it in New York. I felt kind of equally qualified to do both. Would I be willing to put out a test that gives individual students scores on that? Not a chance. And that's one thing we do struggle with at the state level is I have to come along and create a test that 250,000 students in each grade level are taking, and I'm basing it from the same learning standards that we have been created by our teachers and then have been put out there. Mm-hmm. And I hear constantly, and I know this is true, that they say, oh boy, I wasn't prepared for that because that was not, you know, we didn't spend as much time on that, or, oh, we spent a whole unit on this and it wasn't on the test. So there's still that level of autonomy that's happening, you know, in a classroom level. And the level of aggregation, kind of the error that goes into the reporting, you know, am I still pretty confident that even if you didn't cover, you know, that one little topic, do I think I can aggregate the grades 3 through 8 math results up to kind of get a sense of your school and then your district and then our state as a whole? Frankly, I do. Do I think I could do that across the country? Yeah, sure. But can I report that at the state level? Maybe. Can I report it at the district level? Ugh. Can I report it at the school level? Heck no. And so that's where and it goes, you know, I said, Kristen hit it immediately. The purpose and the use of this comes out. If our question is, do kids in the U.S. know algebra? Yeah, we could probably bang that out pretty quickly. If our question is, you know, does Zach know algebra? Is Zach ready for college level mathematics? Is Zach any of those things? Or even, is Zach's school, you know, doing a decent job doing them? It kind of gets a little trickier at that point.
Kirsten? Oh, yeah, go please, Lesley.
I was going to say, I think that algebra is perhaps an easier example. And once you sort of get to thinking about perhaps, you know, reading or ELA literacy, or, you know, even further into social studies, like that's where that would get much, much harder. And having lived through several processes now here at the governing board of trying to come up with that framework that is sort of the union of what we think students should know and be able to do in different subjects. I think the argument is very strong. Scott's in, and I hate arguing with him, but it's very strong in math. It is a lot harder to imagine in some of the other subject areas.
No, I think that's right. And honestly, I think one of the strengths of like when you look at like history and social studies kinds of standards is some of that regional variance is actually really good. You're going to focus on different aspects of things. There's certain things that I would argue everybody should know as an American, but like the regional variance, you're going to focus very differently on aspects of things depending on where you are in the history. That seems very, very appropriate. But Kristen, I mean, how do you think about this? I remember a few years ago, Rob Waldron, the former CEO of Curriculum Associate, did this amazing video, which was like, here are 10 mistakes districts make when they buy ed tech, and it was like, and this is good for us, but it's not good for anything else, so stop doing it. Like, so putting that sort of hat on, like if we had more consensus, even just in math, so accepting Leslie's, in my view, very good point. Like, what are some things that might help with just in terms of better efficiency for schools, better learning? Like what are some complications that this introduces?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as someone who, worked, I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into Park in a different lifetime, and so I still
Hey, can you say what Park is, just for in case my aunt's watching, she doesn't follow this.
It was one of the consortia assessments coming out of Race to the Top, and I think it's the Partnership for an Assessment of the Readiness of College and Careers. Whew, did I get that? And, so I am a big fan, personally, of a national perspective, and I think there are a lot of advantages to being able to pool our resources around professional learning, instructional materials, assessments. But I also understand, if when I worked at New York State, Zach, we took a lot of pride in being able to say, our standards and our assessments are, fill in the blank, were developed in partnership with New York State teachers. So I understand that each state wants to be able to claim that as a point of, frankly, validity for their work. But what we see is that there is a lot more commonality than I think the states are actually willing to admit, right? Because they need that validity of saying, well, we had to develop our own because we needed to know and be confident that these standards reflect the expertise and experience of educators in our state. And so I understand that dilemma. And I think that I would like to see states doing a lot more partnerships because there is more commonality than not. I was talking with some folks recently, and I found some performance level descriptors that were developed in Nebraska for the next generation science standards. And they're just absolutely beautiful. I can't imagine the amount of labor that went into these. And, I'm encouraging other states, look, if you don't have any and you need some, don't start from a blank sheet of paper. Look at what other states have done. There's some brilliant work happening at states, and I do wish there was more partnership and collaboration across states, rather than states feeling like they do have to start from scratch.
Well, it seems like now we used to always think about state collaborations in very regional ways. And one of the things that happened with Park and Smarter Balance was states could just find each other in consortia regardless of geography. And it seems like there's opportunities now with technology and with assessment that you can start to think about other kinds of consortia. It does not have to simply be like the New England states coming together. It can be a little bit choose your own adventure. If you want to do these things, and that there's some promise there. One trend that we're starting to see is competency based, and there's a lot of push on towards more competency based grading. Competency based assessments is a big move to like reform the Carnegie unit. How do you all see that affecting this conversation? Does that help with this, having more common data and more common understanding, or does it risk that it's going to further balkanize things?
I mean, I've been watching it with interest for a number of reasons, but to me, what I'm concerned about at the moment is that it feels like we're bifurcating knowledge and skills again, right? And I know there's been that debate over different periods of time in the education world. I don't think they can be divorced, right? You don't want someone graduating high school or college with really great communication skills, but not having any knowledge about a subject to communicate. And so it's like a really interesting and innovative set of challenges that they're trying to solve. And I think what I worry about is people perceiving it as a replacement for academic achievement, assessments of academic achievement. So how do the two fit together is a question for the future.
And I think I agree. I think Lesley's right on that. One of the things that scares me is, and I said to someone the other day, and I probably, this is the largest audience I've said it to, so I'll decide if it ends up being a bad idea to go around saying this, but I think we could solve so much, because you constantly hear it, at least I do, about, oh, you can be a teacher, you never learn anything about assessment. That actually was true in my case. I was certified in 2 states with never learning anything about assessment. And they say, oh, well, we could reform teacher education, and they just think, well, we'll throw them in an entry-level psychometrics class and that will solve everything. I would change everything, and I would have one course that I really think could solve all of this. And it would be a course where teachers learn how to, or anybody learns how to take desired knowledge and skills and see them through into, claims, evidence, and demonstrations. Just to say, how do I take a learning standard and turn it into an actual lesson where I can look at that student's performance, that proxy that Kristen described, and say, yes, based on what I'm seeing right there, I do believe there is evidence that the student is meeting, these expectations that are set out for them. That is not something you learn in teacher school, and that is a fundamental part of quality principled assessment design that really could go so far to this. And so, am I in favor? I'm thrilled about this idea of more locally based performance assessments to say, different tools, right one for the right job. But without that, we have these guiding principles. We have state learning standards. We have performance level descriptions that show how we're interpreting them and teasing them across the continuum. At the same time, if we don't know at the local level how to put it into action and how to do the equivalent of item writing in our classrooms, then we're doing what I've seen some great points in the chat about. We're talking about completely different things, even though we're supposedly anchored on the same standards. So I want to go in this way, but I want to do it correctly, and I want to have a through line where we truly have a balanced assessment system that is assessing the same things instead of an assessment system that everybody takes a crack at, and hopefully we compile the results at the end.
Kirsten, what do you want to add on that? And I don't know if you've seen, there's a question from Charlie Brewer in the chat about performance-based assessments specifically.
I'll just speak. So whenever I think about competency-based models, the one thing that Lesley and Zach both bring up really excellent points I support that are challenges that need to be solved. But one thing that excites me about it as well is that we see in the data that, this bounding chronological age, skill set, and grade level all together is it's just getting harder and harder to do that. We see that in our own data. The diversity of classroom compositions in terms of student knowledge, skills, and abilities is very, very diverse, and that makes teaching even harder. And so if there were a way that we could think more creatively about how to best mix students without getting falsely lured by into saying, oh well, classrooms have to be completely homogenous. No, that's a different problem that I'm not recommending that, but I do think that competency-based models do, some of the ones that I've heard about, just have some real creative thinking around that I think we need to bring to the school organization more broadly. And, performance-based assessments, there are people on this call like Scott, and there are people in this field who have been thinking about performance-based assessments at scale for decades, and we're still struggling with a lot of the same challenges. And I do think that this is, in my perspective, this is where some of the emerging technologies, in terms of not only scoring data, but now with AI, we can think in many creative ways about what constitutes data. Can an oral performance with PowerPoints and a whole mix of media, perhaps we get to a point where AI can consider all of that as data and evaluate it in a way that is responsible and useful. And then now we can think about using performance-based assessments in a way that has not been scalable before this technology. We're not there yet. I'm talking about the future, but I do think there is hope for us being able to revisit performance-based assessments at scale.
Lesley, do you want to talk briefly about, I know at NAGB you all are thinking about what are the next iterations of NAEP potentially going to look like, what are innovative, you've been piloting, there's been a shift from pencil and paper to online. Like, do you want to talk about just how you're thinking about the direction that particular assessment is going to go as we talk about these different kinds of innovative approaches?
Yeah, so we're asking ourselves a lot of questions, probably more than one could bite off at any given time. But I will say, Kristen, you talked about adaptive testing. NAEP has been exploring shifting to adaptive testing for a decade now, and we are planning to, in 2028, actually pilot what we're calling a multi-stage adaptive assessment. NAEP is not an individual student. We're not measuring individual students. We're measuring groups. But because of the design of the assessment, we can't, there's just sort of a fixed block of questions that kids get, and it's randomized, the questions that they see. But we have less ability to measure at the students who are really falling behind that NAEP basic level. We don't have as much precision around students' knowledge and skills at that level. So that is something that we have been pursuing for a while and will be moving towards implementing in 2028 and 2030. So, Kristen talked about this divergence that we're seeing. This is a pattern that we've seen on NAEP since before the pandemic, of higher performing students and lower performing students, the gap between their scores just growing and growing in a really troubling way. And so we want to be able to say more about what those kids at the lower end of the performance scale actually know and actually can do, rather than just they can't do anything. So that's an important shift that we're making. But we're also thinking about, where do we need to be in 5-10 years? Because NAEP is complicated and it's slow to change. And we have an opportunity now to chart our future. So we're thinking from everything from how do we reduce our timelines? Like, how do we leverage AI and streamline our processes so that we can get from a new framework to a report card based on that framework in half the time, for example, that we currently do. It takes about 6 years right now. That's a long time. We are thinking about how do we improve the reporting. NAEP's report card site, the nation's report card site, is sort of about a decade old in terms of its design. It's time for a refresh. So because we want the data to be a lot more useful and accessible to stakeholders, which is a challenge I think every single assessment program faces. I also worked with Kristen on Park, and I remember sitting down designing the score reports, and the psychometricians and the communications folks were battling it out over what words do we need to include on that score report to make sure it was accurate, but no parent is going to understand what that term meant. So it's a constant sort of challenge I think we face.
So we're coming up on time, but there's a question from Andrew Ho that I think is a good one. It kind of brings us back to what we were originally talking about. There's a lot of data. It also can be misused. I think you guys did a really nice job laying out sort of these different sources of data and how they all work together. and why they're important. But there's always a push for sort of more. So we should report more things and so forth. Talk about the tension between more data can be good. It can help, make the tapestry even richer. It can also, be overwhelming. It can obscure things, and it can be used in the worst instances. It can be used to hide things. You can have states that they use a whole bunch of data to hide the real problem points and sort of camouflage it. So talk about what other data, how should people be thinking about this data in the context of other data? And is there such a thing as too much?
Yeah,
I think, good, Kristen.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I'm speaking of the test makers in the crowd have a tendency to overload with information. More directly to Andrew's point, Andrew's question, the contextualized variables. I think this is a hard question to answer, because on the one hand, I want to know, in order to interpret the scores, it would be very helpful, and I would want to know a lot about opportunity to learn. Because when I look at an item and the psychometrics on an item psychometrics is wholly dependent upon a student's opportunity to learn, and we don't have data on that variable. We have a lot of proxies. We have proxies for opportunity to learn in terms of school funding and other things like that. And then those can SES, and then those can then lead to very dangerous misinterpretations where people confound opportunity to learn with student capability, and that's very, very problematic. So I think it's a very, very tricky question to figure out, how do we get the data we need and not to support valid interpretations rather than additional data that would just further confuse the issue.
I see nodding. I'm going to take I see nodding. I'm going to take that as agreement. First of all, I want to thank you. You guys did the impossible, which is not to fly further from Earth than any humans ever before. It's to have an hour discussion on assessment and data that is interesting and engaging, and you guys delivered that. So thank you very much. I'm also thankful to our the attendees. I'm thankful for all some great questions. You can keep the conversation going in the chat if you want. If you're watching this later, you can reach out to our panelists. If you're watching it now, you can engage them in the chat even when we log off. And I want to thank everybody who's watching either now or later for their time and attention to this matter. And keep in touch with what we're doing at Bellwether at bellwether.org. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.